Welcome to my channel, where we unravel the hidden truths, haunting scandals, and untold stories of the most fascinating figures in history. In this video, we'll dive deep into the life and legacy of one of the most tragic queens of the Tudor era, Catherine Howard, the teenage bride who briefly held the heart of King Henry VIII before being swept away by the brutal tides of betrayal, politics, and power. Stay with me as we explore her whirlwind rise, heartbreaking downfall, and the enduring fascination that keeps her story alive even today. Now imagine this: the corridors of Hampton Court echo with laughter once more. The court has grown quiet in recent years, weighed down by politics and the king's increasingly bitter demeanor. But now there's a change in the air. A radiant new queen, barely out of girlhood, has captured the monarch's attention. She's young, beautiful, and dances with the lightness of someone untouched by the burdens of power. Her name is Catherine Howard, and for a brief, shining moment, it seems that joy has returned to Henry's aging heart. To the outside world, it's a fairy tale. A beautiful girl rises from relative obscurity to become the wife of the most powerful man in England. Her gowns shimmer with gold, her smile reignites courtly splendor, and her every step is trailed by admiration. She is the cousin of the infamous Boleyn, yet she promises none of Anne's danger. Catherine appears to be compliant, cheerful, and above all, loyal. But behind the glittering facade of this sudden queenship lies a past she cannot outrun and a court ready to turn whispers into weapons. Catherine Howard's story isn't just one of scandal. It is a chilling reflection of how the ambitions of others, the crushing expectations of royalty, and the rigid morality of Tudor society could destroy a life in the blink of an eye. She was no seasoned political player, no master manipulator. She was a teenager, barely prepared for the games of courtly survival, let alone for the suspicion that came with wearing the crown. Her rise to power was stunningly swift. Her fall was even swifter. In this video, we'll trace the steps of Catherine's short life, beginning with her early years in the chaotic household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, through her unexpected marriage to the king, and into the dark heart of the investigation that led to her execution. We'll look at the people who shaped her fate, both those who lifted her and those who betrayed her. We'll uncover the difference between the woman Catherine truly was and the image history has often painted of her. And we'll ask the essential question: was she merely a victim of circumstance, or was there something more? So, whether you're a Tudor enthusiast, a lover of royal intrigue, or simply curious about the woman whose brief reign ended in such devastating tragedy, this is the story for you. Let's begin. Catherine Howard's early life unfolded in a world that was at once privileged and perilously unguarded. Born around 1524 into the powerful and sprawling Howard family, she carried noble blood and the expectations of high birth. But her lineage was no guarantee of close supervision or stability. Her father, Lord Edmund Howard, was a younger son of the Duke of Norfolk and had little wealth or standing at court. Struggling financially and professionally, he failed to provide Catherine with a strong parental presence. As a result, Catherine was sent to live in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, at Lambeth, an arrangement that would come to define her formative years and, ultimately, influence the trajectory of her brief and tragic life. The Duchess's household was large, chaotic, and somewhat neglected. It housed many wards, ladies-in-waiting, and young girls of noble descent, among them Catherine. Though intended to serve as a place of moral and educational instruction, the household was poorly regulated, offering the young Catherine an odd combination of genteel privilege and dangerous freedom. Unlike the strict, cloistered upbringing that might have been expected of a future queen, Catherine's youth was marked by lax discipline, insufficient supervision, and frequent opportunities for flirtation and secretive encounters. At night, the girls would sometimes unlock their dormitory doors to allow gentlemen visitors, a practice that was tacitly tolerated or simply overlooked in the bustling house. It was within this environment that Catherine formed early relationships that would later return to haunt her. Most notably, she became romantically involved with Henry Mannix, her music teacher, who admitted to inappropriate intimacy with the young girl. While this relationship was arguably more playful than carnal, it already demonstrated Catherine's vulnerability and the absence of protective oversight. Later, her connection with Francis Dereham, a more serious suitor who addressed her as his wife and likely consummated their relationship, would solidify the pattern. Dereham saw himself as betrothed to Catherine, and their relationship, however secretive, bore the hallmarks of a premarital contract, something that, under the moral standards of Tudor society, could have been recognized as binding. Yet, despite these entanglements, Catherine remained largely unaware of the political and personal consequences of her youthful liaisons. She was spirited, attractive, and possessed a charm that made her a natural centerpiece in any gathering. Her beauty was widely noted. Blonde, curvaceous, and vivacious, she embodied the Tudor ideal of feminine grace. But she lacked the educational grounding and political foresight of women like Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn. The kind of survival instinct and intellectual sharpness that might have guided her through the dangerous terrain of courtly life had not been instilled in her. What she had instead was a carefree warmth, a romantic heart, and an eagerness to be loved. Catherine's transition from the domestic sphere of the Duchess's house to the glittering and perilous stage of the royal court was facilitated by Lady Jane Rochford, the widow of George Boleyn and a woman long entangled in the intimate dramas of the Tudor monarchy. Lady Rochford, who served as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, played a key role in bringing Catherine to court, likely seeing her youthful beauty and noble blood as an asset to be strategically deployed. Jane may have sensed the opportunity to curry favor through Catherine's charms, or perhaps she genuinely sought to advance the girl's prospects. Whatever her motives, it was Lady Rochford who made Catherine visible to the king. Henry VIII was nearing 50 when he first laid eyes on Catherine Howard. Time and suffering had not been kind to him. His once athletic frame had grown heavy, and his personality had hardened into suspicion and cruelty. The collapse of his marriage to Anne of Cleves had left him disillusioned and humiliated. That union, brokered by his chief minister Thomas Cromwell for political gain, had failed to ignite any personal affection. Henry's distaste for Anne was so profound that he had the marriage annulled after just 6 months. He was eager for a fresh start, for youth and vitality to invigorate his aging soul and restore his masculine pride. In stark contrast to the stoic Anne of Cleves, Catherine was light on her feet, flirtatious, and entirely unburdened by political calculation. To Henry, she seemed the embodiment of springtime after a long, gray winter. Her presence was like a balm to his wounded pride, a reminder of his days of power and virility. Almost overnight, he became enamored. His affection was not the cautious, statecraft-informed love he had shown for Catherine of Aragon, nor the intense, world-altering obsession he had once harbored for Anne Boleyn. This was something more wistful, an old man's yearning for youth, beauty, and uncomplicated adoration. Their courtship moved quickly. By summer of 1540, just weeks after his annulment from Anne of Cleves, Henry had made his intentions clear. He lavished Catherine with jewels and gowns, elevated her status at court, and began referring to her in the most affectionate terms. For Catherine, the attention was both thrilling and bewildering. She had grown up in a world where male attention was a currency, but the king's affections carried a weight and visibility she could never have imagined. As she stepped into this new role, her past, carelessly lived and hastily forgotten, trailed behind her like a shadow waiting to emerge. Catherine's elevation to queen consort was formalized in a quiet ceremony on July 28, 1540. Unlike the grand pageantry that had surrounded Henry's earlier marriages, this wedding was a subdued affair. Nonetheless, it marked a significant personal triumph for the king. Catherine was his 5th wife, and her youth seemed to promise a renewed future. The court embraced her with cautious enthusiasm. While some saw in her a symbol of renewal, others were wary of her naivety and the ambitious family that stood behind her. The Howards, having already seen one niece ascend to queenship in Anne Boleyn, were keen to reinforce their influence. But the memory of Anne's fall, of the blood that stained the scaffold at the Tower, remained fresh in many minds. In those early months, Catherine played her role with grace. She was affectionate toward Henry, attentive to her duties, and visibly delighted by the privileges of queenship. Her apartments were richly furnished, and she presided over courtly entertainments with youthful charm. Henry, for his part, was enraptured. He spoke of her as a rose without a thorn, a telling phrase that suggested both idealization and dangerous naivety. Yet beneath the surface of this romantic tableau, the seeds of tragedy had already begun to germinate. Catherine's past, so carelessly buried beneath silks and smiles, could not be hidden forever. Those who had known her at Lambeth, those who had shared in the nighttime games and the whispered promises, still lived. Francis Dereham, once her lover and perhaps her fiancé in all but name, resurfaced, seeking a position within her household. Whether out of arrogance or desperation, he expected the new queen to reward his past intimacy with preferment. Catherine, either out of guilt or fear, brought him into her service, a fateful decision that would lead to devastating consequences. Meanwhile, Catherine had begun a flirtation with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. Whether this was a romantic escapade or a genuine love affair is unclear, but their secret meetings, often facilitated by Lady Rochford, placed Catherine in grave danger. If her relationship with Dereham had been foolish but forgivable, her liaison with Culpeper was reckless. It suggested not merely a lapse in judgment, but a betrayal of the king's trust. And trust, for Henry, was a fragile and conditional gift. Once broken, it could never be restored. By the autumn of 1541, rumors had begun to swirl. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, received an anonymous letter detailing the Queen's past and her current indiscretions. At first, Henry refused to believe it. His Catherine, his beloved Rose, could not have betrayed him. But the evidence mounted. Confessions were extracted, testimonies gathered, and within weeks the illusion crumbled. Catherine was arrested, interrogated, and confined to her rooms. Her cries echoed through the corridors of Hampton Court as she pleaded for mercy. The swiftness with which Henry's affection turned to rage was astonishing. Once so tender, he now referred to Catherine with scorn and fury. The betrayal cut deeply, not only because it wounded his pride but because it exposed his longing for youth and beauty as folly. Catherine, barely out of girlhood, had failed to meet the impossible expectations placed upon her. She had not been the blameless flower he had so desperately needed her to be. Catherine Howard was executed on February 13, 1542. She was likely no older than 19. Her life had been a brief, glittering ascent followed by a harrowing plunge into disgrace. She died with a mixture of dignity and terror, reportedly expressing regret not for her sins, but for not having lived differently. In her final words, she claimed she died a queen, but would rather have died the wife of Thomas Culpeper. Her story remains one of the most poignant in Tudor history, not because of grand political machinations or religious upheaval, but because of its deeply human dimensions. Catherine was not a schemer or a reformer. She was a girl caught in the machinery of dynastic ambition and royal desire, elevated beyond her wisdom, and then punished for failing to become the fantasy she had been cast to play. Her early life, shaped by freedom without protection, led her into a world where freedom had the highest cost. And in that tragic arc, from the unsupervised dormitories of Lambeth to the silken chambers of Hampton Court, we see not just the fall of a queen, but the enduring peril of innocence mistaken for virtue. Catherine Howard's rise to queenship was as sudden as it was stunning. In the summer of 1540, just weeks after Henry VIII annulled his brief and politically motivated marriage to Anne of Cleves, he married Catherine in what many at court regarded as a surprising and hasty union. Barely 16 or 17 years old, Catherine was everything Henry was not: youthful, radiant, energetic, and unburdened by the weight of past marriages or political entanglements. Henry, on the other hand, was approaching 50, beset by ill health, a festering leg wound, and an increasingly volatile temperament. His disappointment in Anne of Cleves had deepened his longing for affection, vitality, and validation. In Catherine's presence, he found all three. The wedding, held privately on the 28th of July in the year 1540, lacked the grandeur of Henry's previous nuptials. Yet the significance of the event was no less profound. To the king, Catherine was not merely a new bride, but a symbol of rejuvenation, a rose without a thorn, as he famously called her. She seemed untouched by the political strife, religious turmoil, and personal betrayals that had scarred his previous unions. Her presence reinvigorated him, and for a brief period, Henry believed he had found both personal happiness and a renewed sense of purpose. As queen, Catherine was ushered into a life of opulence. Her gowns were fashioned from the richest silks and velvets, adorned with gold thread, pearls, and precious stones. Jewels flooded her coffers: rings, brooches, necklaces, and elaborate headdresses, each a token of the king's overwhelming affection and extravagant generosity. Her apartments were redecorated with the finest tapestries and furnishings, and her court became a hub of music, dancing, and youthful exuberance. Unlike her predecessor, the reserved and pragmatic Anne of Cleves, Catherine embraced the pomp and pleasure of queenship with open arms. Catherine's behavior at court reflected her youth and the relatively carefree environment in which she had been raised. She delighted in parties, pageants, and masquerades. Her laughter filled the halls, and her easy charm won her many admirers. Her ladies-in-waiting were young and beautiful, and the queen surrounded herself with those who shared her taste for gaiety and indulgence. For a time, the royal court resembled a festival, with Catherine at its joyous center. Yet along with the finery and festivities came the crushing expectations of monarchy. Catherine was now the wife of the King of England, a title that carried both privilege and peril. She was expected to conduct herself with dignity, uphold the moral authority of the crown, and above all, produce a male heir. The birth of a son would secure her position, elevate her family, and finally deliver to Henry the dynastic certainty he had long sought. For the Howard faction, Catherine's powerful and ambitious relatives, this expectation was not only a duty but a calculated hope. Their position at court was bolstered by Catherine's status, and her success as queen could translate into political dominance for the entire family. The Howards, led by Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, had already experienced both the heights and dangers of proximity to the throne. And Boleyn, Catherine's cousin, had once been their shining star before her catastrophic fall and execution. With Catherine's ascent, the family saw an opportunity for redemption and influence. They maneuvered cautiously, aware of the fragility of courtly favor, but hopeful that Catherine's youth and fertility would finally bring forth the long-desired male heir. However, Catherine's elevation did not come with the strategic or intellectual acumen that had defined some of her predecessors. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, who had been a Spanish princess with years of formal education, or in Boleyn, who had cultivated political savvy and religious discourse at European courts, Catherine Howard was untrained in diplomacy and unaware of the deeper currents of power that flowed beneath the surface of royal life. Her focus remained largely on personal pleasures, emotional gratification, and the excitement of her new role. Henry's affection for Catherine bordered on obsessive. He showered her with praise and gifts, spoke of her glowingly in public, and treated her as a prized treasure. But this affection came with intense scrutiny. As her favor with the king grew, so too did the eyes upon her. Courtiers, rival factions, and foreign ambassadors all took note of her movements. Rumors circulated, some born of envy, others of genuine suspicion. The court, ever a place of whispers and wagers, began to dissect every glance, every word, every late-night meeting. Still, for much of the year 1541, Catherine maintained her position as the beloved queen. She joined the king on progresses through the kingdom, where the public greeted her with cheers and curiosity. She was presented as the future mother of England's next heir, and her radiant appearance only enhanced this narrative. Her portraits from the time depict a young woman of grace and poise, her clothing sumptuous, her expression demure. But behind the silks and smiles, anxiety began to take root. Despite her outward joy, Catherine had a secret, several in fact. Her past indiscretions, particularly her relationships with Henry Manox and Francis Dereham during her time in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, remained unknown to the king. These liaisons, conducted before she came to court, were risky not only because of their moral implications, but because of the potential political consequences. If revealed, they could be construed as proof of unchastity before marriage, which, under Tudor standards, was unacceptable for a queen. Worse still, they could be seen as acts of deception against the king himself. Francis Dereham, perhaps emboldened by Catherine's new status, sought employment within her household. Whether he came to blackmail her, rekindle their romance, or simply claim his place at her side is uncertain. Catherine, possibly out of fear or lingering affection, offered him a position. This act of mercy, or misjudgment, would prove fatal. Soon, whispers reached the ears of those eager to discredit her. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was among the first to take the matter seriously. He presented the king with a detailed letter outlining the allegations against Catherine. Henry's reaction was one of disbelief, followed swiftly by fury. His vision of Catherine as a pure and youthful ideal shattered. The betrayal, real or perceived, struck him not only as a personal humiliation, but as an affront to divine order. How could his rose without a thorn have deceived him so completely? His heartbreak gave way to investigation. Interrogations were conducted, confessions were extracted, and the evidence became irrefutable. Dereham admitted to his prior relationship with the Queen. Manox, too, confessed to inappropriate intimacy. Worse still, evidence surfaced suggesting Catherine had engaged in secret meetings with Thomas Culpeper, a favored gentleman of the king's privy chamber. These meetings, allegedly facilitated by Lady Jane Rochford, added a new layer of scandal. Culpeper was young, handsome, and close to the king. The implication of an affair between the Queen and a member of the royal household not only violated personal trust, but threatened the sanctity of the monarchy. Henry's rage deepened, and Catherine's fall from grace became inevitable. In November of 1541, Catherine was arrested and confined to her apartments. Her cries for mercy were heard throughout the palace, but the king refused to see her. Those who had once courted her favor now distanced themselves. The Howards scrambled to salvage their reputations, insisting they had no knowledge of her past. But the damage was done. Catherine was stripped of her title, and her household was dismantled. Interrogations continued, and the net of suspicion widened. Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper were both executed in December, one drawn and quartered as a traitor, the other beheaded in recognition of his prior service to the king. Lady Rochford, driven to madness by the events, was confined to the Tower of London. Though insane at the time of her sentencing, a special Act of Parliament was passed to allow her execution. Catherine's own fate was sealed. She remained imprisoned throughout the winter, isolated and despairing. On the 10th of February, she was taken to the Tower. 2 days later, on the morning of February 12, 1542, she was led to the scaffold. Eyewitnesses described her as pale but composed. Her final words were a prayer for mercy and a request for God's forgiveness. She claimed she died as a queen but would rather have died the wife of Thomas Culpeper, a sentiment that only deepened the tragedy of her short life. Catherine Howard's reign had lasted little more than 18 months. It was a whirlwind of splendor, scandal, and sorrow. She had been thrust into a role for which she was neither prepared nor protected. Her youth, once her greatest asset, proved to be her undoing. In the gilded halls of power, innocence was no shield, and affection offered no sanctuary. In the end, Catherine's story is not simply one of personal downfall. It reflects the precariousness of life at the Tudor court, where favor could vanish overnight and the stakes of love were intertwined with life and death. She had been adored, envied, judged, and finally condemned. Her memory, like that of her cousin and Boleyn, would linger in the imagination of England, a symbol of the dangers faced by women caught in the tempest of royal ambition. Through her, the fragility of power and the brutality of court politics are laid bare. Her rise and fall remain one of the most dramatic and human chapters in the saga of Henry VIII's turbulent reign. The story of Queen Catherine Howard's downfall is not one of grand betrayal plotted in the shadows of diplomacy, nor of high-stakes religious dissent, but of deeply personal missteps and private indiscretions that were dragged into the harsh light of Tudor politics. It is a tale of whispers given weight by ambition, of youthful secrets re-emerging with devastating force, and of a king whose boundless affection transformed overnight into merciless fury. In the intricate and often unforgiving court of Henry VIII, even a whisper could prove fatal, especially when the voice belonged to a monarch who had once loved blindly and now judged without mercy. Catherine Howard had stepped into the role of queen in the summer of the year 1540, a teenager with little political education and even less understanding of the consequences of her past. Raised with insufficient supervision in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, her youth had not been one of strict morality or careful grooming for the crown. It was instead one of flirtation, spontaneity, and secret encounters, none of which would have mattered had she remained a lady of noble but quiet status. But once she became Queen of England, the meaning of her past shifted dramatically. What had once been mischief now looked like treason. Among the men from Catherine's past, Francis Dereham loomed largest. He had been more than a youthful dalliance. He had addressed her as his wife, and likely believed they had a mutual understanding of marriage. During their time together in the Duchess's household, they had shared words, gifts, and physical intimacy. In the loose framework of Tudor social norms, such a relationship could be interpreted as a pre-contract. Essentially, a promise of marriage that, if proven, could nullify her union with Henry and cast serious doubt on her honor. Dereham, aware of her rise to queenship, foolishly or arrogantly reappeared in her life seeking favor, believing his past intimacy with her entitled him to a position in her household. Catherine, either from guilt or desperation, brought him into her service, a decision that would soon be seen not as generosity, but as recklessness. Even more perilous was her relationship with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. He was handsome, ambitious, and often near the queen due to his favored status. Whether their association had begun before her marriage or after, whether it was consummated or confined to flirtation, remains partially obscured. What is known, however, is that they met in secret, often late at night, and that these meetings were arranged with the help of Lady Jane Rochford, the widow of George Boleyn and sister-in-law to the late Anne Boleyn. Lady Rochford, who had long navigated the dangerous politics of the Tudor court, now played a central role in facilitating an affair that would unravel. The court was a place where nothing remained hidden for long. Whispers grew louder, and rumors reached ears eager to hear scandal. In early November of the year 1541, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a figure central to both the Reformation and Henry's inner circle, received an anonymous letter. The letter laid bare the accusations against Catherine, referencing her prior relationship with Francis Dereham and her alleged liaisons with Thomas Culpeper. The writer, whose identity remains unknown, had not only heard whispers but had gathered details, enough to suggest that the Queen had deceived the king and possibly committed adultery. Cranmer was a cautious man, but also a committed servant of the king and a reformer who understood the gravity of moral and political scandal. He chose a careful moment to deliver the news to Henry, slipping the letter into the king's hand during Mass at Hampton Court Palace. Henry read it with initial disbelief. Catherine, the rose without a thorn, the light of his aging heart, could not possibly be guilty of such betrayal. At first, he resisted investigation. His pride, his trust, and his emotional investment in Catherine made denial an easier refuge than truth. But Cranmer persisted. He began a discreet inquiry, questioning members of the Queen's former household and pressing for details. The accounts he gathered painted a picture of a young woman with a past far removed from the virtuous image she had cultivated as queen. Mannix, her former music teacher, admitted to having been improperly intimate with her. Dereham, under pressure, revealed their previous relationship and insisted that Catherine had been his fiancée in all but name. He claimed that their intimacy had been tantamount to a marriage contract and that she had referred to him in the same terms. Crucially, he accused her of now favoring Thomas Culpeper, whose name had begun to circulate as a frequent, though secret, visitor to the Queen's chambers. Confronted with this growing body of evidence, Henry could no longer turn away. What had once seemed an anonymous attempt to smear his queen now appeared to be the uncomfortable truth. His heartbreak gave way to fury. The betrayal struck at the very core of his identity. He had chosen Catherine not only as a wife but as a symbol of his renewed virility, his enduring power, and his ability to command the love of youth and beauty. To discover that she had not only lied to him, but possibly cuckolded him, shattered the illusion that had briefly comforted him in his final years. Henry's grief and rage were not tempered by time or reason. His court was transformed overnight. Catherine was placed under house arrest, confined to her apartments, and denied access to the king. She wept and pleaded for mercy, but the door to Henry's heart had slammed shut. She would never see him again. Her household was dismantled, and her closest companions, particularly those who had assisted in her meetings with Culpeper, were seized for interrogation. Culpeper and Dereham were arrested and tortured. Under duress, both confessed, though their stories diverged in crucial ways. Dereham insisted that his intimacy with Catherine had occurred before her marriage, and that he had been replaced in her affections by Culpeper. Culpeper's testimony suggested that the Queen had met with him often and that there were intentions, though he stopped short of admitting that they had been physically intimate. Whether to protect her or himself, Culpeper's partial confession only deepened suspicions. His words, whether true or not, convinced the king that the Queen had not only lied about her virginity, but had actively betrayed him after becoming his wife. Lady Rochford, when questioned, fell into hysteria. Overwhelmed by guilt or fear, she lost her reason, reportedly descending into madness. In a cruel twist, Parliament passed a bill allowing the execution of the insane, a legal exception made solely to ensure that she would not escape the punishment Henry believed she deserved. The machinery of retribution moved quickly. Culpeper and Dereham were tried and sentenced to death. Dereham, whose prior relationship with the Queen was seen as the deeper offense, was drawn, hanged, and quartered, a brutal sentence reserved for traitors. Culpeper, who had once stood in the king's favor, was granted the mercy of beheading. By December of the year 1541, it was clear that Catherine would not escape the fate that had claimed Anne Boleyn before her. Her case was debated in council, and her sentence passed without a formal trial. Parliament declared her guilty of treason based on her pre-contract with Dereham and her concealed relationship with Culpeper. Her marriage to Henry was invalidated retroactively, and preparations were made for her execution. During her final weeks, Catherine remained imprisoned, her mind tormented by what awaited her. She was barely 19, a girl who had once reveled in fine gowns and dancing, now reduced to prayer and sorrow. On the night before her death, she reportedly requested that the executioner's block be brought to her room so she could practice laying her head upon it, a detail both chilling and heartbreaking, whether legend or truth. On the morning of the 12th of February in the year 1542, Catherine Howard was led to the scaffold at the Tower of London. Dressed in black, she approached the block with composure. Her final words expressed repentance and a prayer for the king's forgiveness. Some accounts, romanticized and possibly apocryphal, claim she declared she died the wife of Thomas Culpeper. More reliably, witnesses recorded that she spoke of her sins, her unworthiness, and her hope for salvation. With one stroke of the executioner's axe, her brief and tragic life came to an end. Lady Rochford was executed shortly afterward. Her involvement in facilitating the Queen's meetings with Culpeper had sealed her fate. Her execution marked a grim epilogue to a tale defined by secrecy, desperation, and courtly misjudgment. In the aftermath of Catherine's execution, Henry VIII was said to have fallen into a deep melancholy. The man who had once called her his rose without a thorn now brooded over her betrayal and the public humiliation it had caused him. He withdrew from court life, and for a time, the royal household operated in a state of mourning and unease. The shock of Catherine's fall was profound, not only for Henry but for the court that had once adored her. Her death was not merely a punishment. It was a warning, a reminder that the crown could be both the highest honor and the sharpest blade. Catherine Howard's fate was sealed by the convergence of personal vulnerability and political exploitation. Her past, which might have remained hidden or irrelevant in another context, became weaponized by the dynamics of courtly rivalry and the merciless logic of Tudor monarchy. She was too young, too inexperienced, and too unguarded to navigate the dangerous waters of royal favor. Her misjudgments were real, but they were also the products of a system that elevated her too quickly and abandoned her too easily. The tragedy of Catherine Howard endures because it is more than a historical anecdote. It is a reflection of how power, intimacy, and expectation collide within systems that offer little room for error, especially for women. Her whispers became confessions. Her betrayals, however misunderstood or involuntary, became treason. And in the silent chambers of Hampton Court and the echoing stones of the Tower, the ghost of a girl queen still lingers, young, doomed, and forever caught between affection and accusation. In the cold shadows of Hampton Court, the final unraveling of Catherine Howard began with the grim inevitability of a queen caught in a web too intricate to escape. What had once seemed a golden rise through the Tudor ranks was now a fall more tragic than any she could have imagined. She was young, barely 17 or 18 when the scandal broke, and utterly unequipped to withstand the crushing force of Tudor justice. The investigation that followed the whispers of her past was swift, methodical, and merciless. Every word spoken in confession, every line scratched into parchment, edged her closer to the scaffold. By November of the year 1541, the accusations against Catherine were no longer whispers. They had formed a storm. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer had delivered the anonymous letter to Henry VIII, detailing the Queen's previous relationship with Frances Dereham and her current intimacy with Thomas Culpeper. At first, the king dismissed the claims, unwilling to believe his young bride, his so-called rose without a thorn, could be guilty of deceit or infidelity. But Cranmer, loyal to both the king and the reformist cause, pursued the matter quietly, gathering evidence and pushing forward the inquiry until even Henry's pride could no longer shelter Catherine. The interrogations began soon after. Frances Dereham and Thomas Culpeper were arrested and held in the Tower of London. There they were tortured or heavily pressured into revealing the truth, or at least a version of it that served the crown's desire for clarity, however damning. Dereham, already bitter from having been pushed aside by Catherine in favor of Culpeper, confessed to having known her carnally before her marriage to the king. He insisted that theirs had been a relationship of intention, an engagement of sorts, sanctioned by words and consummated by acts. In Tudor law, a pre-contract of this kind could invalidate a royal marriage. Worse, it could make her union with Henry not only unlawful but treasonous, as it implied that she had deceived the king. Culpeper, when questioned, admitted to secret meetings with the Queen, though he denied any consummation of their affair. He claimed Catherine had declared her love for him, and that they had both intended to do more than speak privately. The ambiguity of his testimony was deliberate. He may have hoped to save his life by avoiding a full confession of adultery. But in Henry's eyes, Even the intention to betray was betrayal enough. Adultery with the queen was not merely a personal betrayal. It was a threat to the legitimacy of the royal line and the very sanctity of the monarchy. Catherine herself was questioned, though not tortured. At first, she denied the allegations. She claimed to be innocent, both of premarital contracts and postmarital impropriety. But when presented with testimony and written confessions, she broke. She admitted to her youthful indiscretions with Dereham, acknowledging that they had engaged in sexual acts prior to her arrival at court. However, she insisted that the relationship had ended long before she married the king and that it held no meaning in her life as queen. As for Culpeper, her answers were more carefully chosen. She denied adultery but could not explain away the clandestine meetings. The queen's ladies-in-waiting were also interrogated. Some claimed they knew nothing. Others admitted they had suspected something was amiss. The strongest testimony came from Lady Jane Rochford, the widow of George Boleyn, who had arranged the queen's meetings with Culpeper. Jane admitted to her role and implicated the queen in romantic designs, though she too denied any knowledge of physical intimacy. Her confession, incomplete but damning, sealed her fate alongside Catherine's. Once the interrogations were concluded and the statements collected, the next stage began: the legal proceedings that would formalize the queen's condemnation. In a monarchy where the kings will be law, there was no need for a public trial. Instead, Parliament was called upon to pass a Bill of Attainder, a legislative act that declared a person guilty of treason without the need for a jury. This process was often used for high-ranking individuals whose public trials might cause unrest or embarrassment to the crown. Catherine's attainder was drafted quickly and passed through both houses of Parliament in early February of the year 1542. The bill declared that Catherine had led an abominable, base, carnal, voluptuous, and vicious life before her marriage, and that she had intended to return to her old abominable life, even after becoming queen. Her meetings with Culpeper were described as treasonous in nature. Though no evidence of physical adultery was conclusively proven, the intent was deemed criminal. The attainder carried with it a sentence of death, which Henry approved without hesitation. Catherine was imprisoned in Sion Abbey before being moved to the Tower of London on February 10th. There, she awaited her execution in the same rooms once occupied by Anne Boleyn. The parallel was not lost on anyone. Two queens from the same powerful family, both executed by the same husband, both undone by charges of sexual misconduct and betrayal. Catherine, like Anne, had come to the king's attention through her beauty and charm. And like Anne, she would lose her life to the merciless machinery of Tudor justice. On the morning of February 12, 1542, Catherine was led to the scaffold on Tower Green. She was dressed in black velvet and walked steadily despite her youth and the weight of her fate. Witnesses later recorded that she appeared calm and composed. In her final speech, she asked for the forgiveness of those she had wronged and expressed repentance for her sins. One report, possibly embellished in later years, claimed that she declared she would have rather died the wife of Thomas Culpeper. Whether those words were spoken or merely imagined by a dramatist, they reflected a truth that Catherine had loved foolishly, recklessly, and perhaps sincerely, though not wisely. The executioner, who had once dispatched Anne Boleyn, brought down the axe in a single stroke. Catherine's body was buried nearby, next to the remains of her cousin. Hours later, Lady Rochford was also executed, a broken figure whose involvement had been both practical and tragic. Her role in facilitating the meetings may have stemmed from duty, desperation, or misguided loyalty, but it had placed her at the heart of a scandal too large to survive. The public reaction to Catherine's death was complex. Among the people, there was little open mourning. Queens had come and gone, and executions had become familiar events under Henry's reign. But there was unease. Catherine had been young and, in many ways, naive. Her execution, so soon after her marriage, underscored the terrifying swiftness with which favor could become fatal. To some, she was a sinner justly punished. To others, she was a victim of ambition, of family pressure, and of a court that had offered her adoration but no protection. Henry VIII, for his part, showed no outward signs of remorse. If he grieved, he did so privately. But the stain of Catherine's execution lingered on his reputation. The romantic king who had once broken with Rome for love was now the aging monarch who had sent two of his wives to the block. Catherine's death solidified a growing image of Henry as a man of frightening volatility, a sovereign who could elevate and destroy in equal measure, and whose personal pain translated into public violence. The court became a place of fear as much as favor. Nobles watched their words, ladies guarded their glances, and ambition was tempered by caution. Politically, the Howard family was shattered by Catherine's fall. The Duke of Norfolk, who had risen high through his niece's marriage, barely escaped punishment himself. Many of his relatives and allies were arrested, questioned, and disgraced. The Howards, who had once imagined themselves as kingmakers, now retreated in disgrace, their ambitions burned to ash alongside the memory of their queen. Religiously, the execution emboldened the conservative faction's enemies. Reformers used Catherine's fall to argue that morality could not be assumed based on bloodlines or noble names. Cranmer and others within the Protestant circle continued to gain influence, shaping the church and court toward their goals. The Queen's downfall served as a lesson in virtue, one defined by male authority and royal control. Her death, though tragic, became a tool in the shaping of Tudor ideology, that the monarchy was unchallengeable, even in matters of the heart. The execution of Catherine Howard did not bring Henry peace. It did not restore his youth or erase the humiliation of betrayal. It did not deliver the heir he craved, nor the domestic harmony he had once imagined. What it did was draw a final, bloody line through a period of hopeful illusion. Catherine had represented joy, flirtation, and a return to simpler affections. Her death marked the end of such innocence at court. In the years that followed, Henry would marry once more, to Catherine Parr, a mature and intelligent widow who served more as nurse and companion than romantic consort. By then, Henry was a man changed. His health declined, his temper worsened, and his court grew colder. The laughter that had once surrounded Catherine Howard would not be heard again in quite the same way. Her legacy remains that of a girl too young for the crown, placed in a position of impossible expectations, and punished by a system designed to elevate and destroy with equal fervor. Her name is remembered not for governance, not for patronage, nor for great speeches or triumphs, but for tragedy. She is a symbol of the cost of beauty, the danger of desire, and the enduring cruelty of unchecked power. Catherine Howard's fall was not just her own. It was a reflection of a court, a king, and a time when whispers could kill and betrayal, even imagined, could end a queen's life. Catherine Howard's life, though brief and fraught with peril, remains an enduring tale of vulnerability, power, and the unforgiving dynamics of Tudor politics. Her story, often overshadowed by the more extensively chronicled lives of Anne Boleyn or Catherine of Aragon, offers profound insight into the complexities of gender, youth, and ambition in a court governed by suspicion and authority. As the fifth wife of King Henry VIII, Catherine's legacy is often reduced to scandal, but a deeper look reveals a young woman caught in a vortex of expectation, exploitation, and political manipulation, her voice largely lost to time, yet echoing through centuries of historical and cultural inquiry. Catherine was likely around 15 or 16 when she married the king, who by then was nearly 3 decades her senior. Her youth was central to both her appeal and her undoing. To Henry, a man increasingly disillusioned by age, infirmity, and a string of failed marriages, Catherine represented a chance to recapture lost vigor, to restore his manhood in the eyes of the court, and perhaps to finally secure the elusive male heir. But to the Howard family, particularly the ambitious Duke of Norfolk, she was a pawn in a larger political game, an opportunity to secure greater influence at court and return their faction to prominence. The political use of young women was not novel in Tudor England. Yet Catherine's case was particularly tragic because of her personal history. Raised without strict supervision in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Catherine lived in a semi-institutional environment where flirtation and informal liaisons were common. Her relationships with Francis Dereham and later, allegedly, with Thomas Culpeper, were rooted in that youthful context, long before she had any inkling of royal prospects. However, the court had no room for such nuance. What may have begun as private indiscretions became matters of state the moment she became queen. Her reign, such as it was, lasted little more than a year, but within that time Catherine embodied a paradox, simultaneously adored and scrutinized, lavished and isolated. The same court that had welcomed her as a symbol of joy and renewal turned on her with ruthless speed. When Archbishop Thomas Cranmer delivered the allegations against her to Henry, the king was devastated. Henry, a man who alternated between infatuation and suspicion, between hope and vengeance, quickly moved from anguish to fury. Catherine's supposed betrayal was not merely personal, it was political, and in Tudor England, the line between personal betrayal and treason was perilously thin. The process that followed her arrest was cold and systematic. Catherine was subjected to intense interrogation. Her past was dissected with almost clinical precision, and those around her were similarly examined. Francis Dereham admitted to his prior involvement with her, and Thomas Culpeper, then a favored gentleman of the king's privy chamber, was accused of conspiring with her for adulterous purposes. Whether their guilt was real or exaggerated remains a matter of debate, but the result was unequivocal. The machinery of Tudor justice moved swiftly. A bill of attainder, a legal instrument that allowed execution without trial, was drawn up against her. In February of the year 1542, Catherine was executed on Tower Green. She was said to have composed herself with dignity, requesting a block the night before to practice how she might kneel. Her words on the scaffold, as recorded in later sources, asked for God's mercy and acknowledged her faults, though it remains unclear how much was true confession and how much was court-scripted repentance. With her went not only her life but the hopes of the Howard faction, many of whom fell from favor or were implicated in the scandal. The public perception of Catherine's downfall contributed to the growing image of Henry as a tyrant. What had once been interpreted as the righteous indignation of a wronged monarch began to appear more and more like the cruelty of a man hardened by power and disappointment. Catherine's execution, following those of Boleyn and others, reinforced the notion that queenship in Tudor England came with a deadly price. The public, who had once delighted in Catherine's coronation and youthful energy, now watched in grim silence as yet another consort was dispatched to the scaffold. Still, Catherine's legacy is far from static. Over the centuries, historians, playwrights, and novelists have sought to understand her beyond the tabloid narrative of seduction and scandal. Increasingly, she is viewed as a victim of her time, a teenager pushed into a marriage with a volatile monarch, stripped of agency, and condemned for acts committed before she ever became queen. In many ways, her story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of conflating sexuality with treason, and about the perilous position of women in male-dominated courts. There is also an enduring fascination with Catherine because of what she might represent. To some, she is a symbol of youthful folly, of the dangers of naivete in a world governed by ambition. To others, she is a tragic heroine, a girl who never had the tools or the time to learn the rules of the game she was forced to play. Her story continues to inspire reinterpretation. From historical novels and stage dramas to documentaries and fictional series, Catherine is frequently revisited, her image reconfigured to suit modern sensibilities and evolving feminist perspectives. Moreover, Catherine's tale challenges the historian to grapple with source reliability. Much of what is known about her comes from confessions extracted under duress, from politically motivated testimonies, and from accounts written well after her death. These conditions complicate the task of discerning who Catherine truly was. Was she calculating or merely careless? Was her alleged affair with Culpeper a continuation of earlier romantic impulses? Or was she coerced into an emotional entanglement in a court that gave her no autonomy? These questions remain largely unanswerable, but they enrich the historical inquiry, reminding us that beneath the royal titles and political consequences was a very young woman trying, perhaps unsuccessfully, to navigate a treacherous world. In popular culture, Catherine has often been cast in contrast to Boleyn. Whereas Anne is depicted as intelligent, ambitious, and polarizing, Catherine is portrayed as lighthearted, ill-prepared, and tragically doomed. Yet both women shared similar fates and were subject to the same ruthless system. In recent decades, newer portrayals have sought to give Catherine more depth. Films and plays have begun to depict her not as a caricature of reckless youth, but as a complex figure, both shaped by and resisting her environment. The broader lessons of Catherine's story extend beyond the Tudor court. They speak to how societies treat women, especially young women, and how power dynamics are enforced through fear and surveillance. Her rise and fall reflect the fragility of favor in autocratic systems, and the degree to which personal histories can be weaponized for political gain. In this sense, Catherine's tragedy is not merely historical but universal, echoing in modern stories of young women subjected to public scrutiny, institutional neglect, and harsh judgment. Perhaps what continues to captivate audiences about Catherine Howard is the sheer poignancy of her narrative arc. A girl plucked from obscurity, elevated to the highest female position in the realm, only to be publicly disgraced and executed before reaching full adulthood. It is a tale that evokes both sympathy and outrage. Her life was a brief spark in the dark machinery of Tudor politics, yet that spark continues to be examined, reimagined, and remembered. The fascination also stems from the contradictions her story presents. She was queen, yet powerless, admired, yet condemned, loved, yet discarded. Each retelling of her story invites us to reconsider how we view the past and the people who inhabited it. Catherine Howard was not just a victim of her circumstances. She was also a product of a deeply hierarchical, deeply patriarchal world that offered women little recourse once they were deemed inconvenient. Catherine's legacy is not solely about her marriage to Henry or her dramatic end. It is about the intersection of youth and power, of agency and expectation. It is a story that forces us to question not just what happened, but why it happened, and how we continue to remember it. Her brief, tumultuous life may have ended in tragedy, but its echoes remain potent, an ever-relevant reminder of the cost of royal favor and the human lives entangled in the grand narratives of history.